election night is complete and utter confusion.
Even though Tilden won the popular vote, the results from Florida, South Carolina, and Louisiana, where African Americans faced severe violent repression, were undetermined.
Republicans convinced Southern governments to declare enough votes invalid to swing the Electoral College to Hayes.
The Democrats were so outraged by the fact that Tilden was not declared the winner that they began to rally their voters under the slogan "Tilden or Blood."
With the 2020 election already facing chaos in the election process of the pandemic and voting, and the GOP not even promising to accept the results, it's looking like this election in 2020 is going to end in some amount of chaos. This won't be the only election to end with a disputed result. There's obviously Al Gore and George Bush, but arguably the most controversial and chaotic ending to an American presidential election was in 1876. Here to talk about that and explain a little bit about that election, we have Chris Mahin, who is an historian and author from Chicago. Hey, Chris, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So why don't we start by just getting a little background on what was going on in 1876 and really what happened in that election?
Well, the 1876 election takes place obviously after the Civil War and after a number of years of the Reconstruction governments having been in power in states of the former Confederacy. And in the midst of a systematic effort to destroy those Reconstruction governments by forces of the former Confederacy, it takes place at a moment in which some of those Reconstruction state governments have already been overthrown, but some of them still exist and are under stress. And you have a summer in which there are massacres of African American voters. There are systematic efforts at voter suppression. There are paramilitaries, white paramilitaries like the Red Shirts and the White League that systematically attack African American communities, community meetings, and African American voters. And ultimately, you have a situation where when the votes are counted in a number of states, there's very, very bitter dispute as to which candidate won the election. And this is ultimately brought to it's not solved on election day. It's not solved until months after election day is over. And it's ultimately taken to the Congress of the United States, and a deal is worked out between the two parties, which ultimately ends in the Republican candidate becoming the president, but federal troops being withdrawn from the former Confederacy, which allows for a reign of terror to be unleashed, and in some cases, a reign of terror that already existed being intensified in the former Confederacy.
So give me a little background on who were these two candidates and what did each candidate represent at the time?
Well, the Republican presidential candidate is Rutherford B. Hayes. He was the governor of Ohio. He, at the time that he was running, and he was a compromise candidate among different factions within the Republican Party. He had been a soldier, an officer in the Union Army during the Civil War, but was considered to be kind of a mediocre figure in American politics. The Democratic candidate was Samuel Tilden, who was the governor of New York, who ran on an anti-corruption platform, and his claim to fame was that he had, in New York, had taken on the notorious corrupt political figure Bois in New York City and sent him to jail. And as a result, he claimed to be a force opposing corruption and denounced the corruption of the Grant administration, but he was clearly allied with forces within the Democratic Party that had always been hostile to the rights of African Americans, and he specifically refused to condemn massacres which had taken place over the summer against African Americans. So you have a candidate who refuses to condemn white supremacy and refuses to condemn white militias. Does that sound familiar?
Yeah, somewhat. Speaking of which, so looking at what happened in 1876 and the repercussions of the conclusion of that election, which was, I believe, contrary to the popular vote at the time, correct?
Well, here's the important thing to understand, that when election day was over, it appeared as if Samuel Tilden had won more votes than Rutherford B. Hayes. There were 4 states where the election results were in dispute: South Carolina, Florida, Louisiana, and there was one elector from Oregon who they argued should not have allowed to have been an elector. But while Hayes was behind in the popular vote, part of the issue was that the Black vote had been systematically suppressed in those southern states. And most historians argue that had there been a free vote, had there not been the voter suppression, you would have had a situation where the states that had a majority Black population would have gone for Hayes. And in fact, he would have won the popular vote.
Wow, that's a very important point to make, because I think we're facing the very similar problem today, that the popular vote isn't really some sort of idealistic thing when you have voter suppression just running rampant and disallowing people to make their popular vote heard. So what kind of parallels or lessons can we get from 1876 heading into what undoubtedly will be some level of chaos and controversy here in 2020?
Well, I think it's very important that people see that. I mean, what happened in 1876 was you had these decades and decades of struggle for equal rights, struggle to advance and begin the trade union movement. You'd had this entire era of social reform, which was symbolized most dramatically, of course, by the struggle to abolish slavery, but was a general struggle. I mean, this was the period of time where women's rights first began to be asserted, where labor rights first began to be asserted. And at the end of this era, what happens is you have an absolutely critical election where there are forces that run on a program of taking the country backward. And as a result of voter suppression, as a result of intrigue within Congress, they are able to bring about a situation in which certainly in the South, but in the country generally, the struggle to move society forward was taken all the way back and stayed back for 100 years. And so there are elections where the future of a country for 100 years will be decided in that one election, and it will be decided by whether people stand up against voter suppression, whether they stand up against militias. And that's how critical the situation is today in this country, that we can't allow history to repeat itself.
So, Chris, we only had 10 minutes to go over this. Do you have any suggested things out there people could look up to get more on this?
Yes. Well, one book that really gives you a picture of the horrific effects of the Hayes-Tilden Agreement, as it was called, and how things went backward, and is actually a novel called Freedom Road by the novelist Howard Fast. And so I recommend that. Very, very good. The other thing that I would recommend is the works of three people who've written a lot about the role of the South in American politics. One, of course, is Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois and his great work, Black Reconstruction in America. The other would be C. Vann Woodward, who wrote a book, Reunion and Reaction, and he's actually the person who coined the phrase the Compromise of 1877. And he also wrote a book, The Strange Career of Jim Crow. The other would be Nelson Peery, who wrote The Negro National Colonial Question, about the role of the South in American politics. So those are three authors who I would highly recommend. And particularly the Negro National Colonial Question talks about the role of the Hayes-Tilden Agreement as being essentially a fascist coup.
All right, I'll put a link below the video to help people find those. Thanks a lot for coming on. Got a lot out of it, so come back again.
Thank you so much. Definitely will do. I'd be happy to do that. Thank you.
All right, bye-bye.